Spencer Gyges, it's good to see you.
Good to be here, Dan.
Welcome to everyone in the Sophia audience and the larger meaningoflife.tv, bloggingheads.tv audience. This is the Sophia program, available both on streaming video and audio podcast. I'm Daniel Kaufman. I'm a professor of philosophy at Missouri State. And I'm once more joined again by Spencer Gyges. You want to say just a few things, remind everyone who you are, and say whatever you want to say about the situation that currently you're in or not.
I'm a philosophy postdoc at Wuhan University in Wuhan, China. I got my PhD from the University of Colorado in 2018. That should be enough about me. The Wuhan situation, I'm sure everybody's reading about that. The city is quarantined because of this new virus, the Wuhan coronavirus. So I haven't been leaving my apartment really for about a week now. I'm beginning to lose count of the days. They've shut down all internal transportation. I can look out my window, and now I can see a few people walking around, walking their dogs, because the weather's gotten a bit better and people are tired of being cooped up inside. But there are not very many people outside, and when you see them, they've got these masks on. I think I've got one over here, actually. These blue surgical masks. So they've evacuated the consulate. There's a U.S. consulate in Wuhan, and they've evacuated that. But there's still several hundred Americans living in Wuhan, and I'm sure there are more in Hubei province generally. Wuhan's a city of 11 million people. I'm told there are only 9 million people in it now because a couple of million fled when they announced that they were going to block off the city. I don't know why you would give advance warning for something like that. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, because then it just makes your quarantine useless, right? So many people leave that you sort of. How do you receive? I mean, what sort of communications do you receive? I mean, is the Chinese government sort of in regular contact with the population, sort of letting them know what's being done and what to expect in the coming days or weeks? Or is it just like some post-apocalyptic movie where you have no idea what the hell's going on? And
I'll tell you, the scariest day was like the first full day I didn't leave my apartment and seeing all of the crazy stuff that was going around Twitter. Videos of people in the hospitals just falling over on their face, allegedly from this disease. But who knows? Who knows what these videos are?
Exactly.
And it's just like the what the hell is going on factor. The uncertainty really freaked me out. Now it's beginning to get more stable, I guess. I was able to go shopping on Sunday with Tim Perrine, my colleague who lives 7 floors up from me in the same building. I'm able to see him because we're in the same building together. But we went and we got shopping. I've got enough groceries to last me a month, and that puts my mind at ease a little bit. I am in contact with the U.S. Department of State. I'm on their mailing list. So if there's another plane, I'll hear about it. I'm a little bit ambivalent about leaving, though, because you have to pay your own way. Even if they offer you a plane, you have to pay your own way, which I don't think is some big injustice, but it still sucks. And then I can expect some kind of quarantine on the other end. And I think, if I'm going to be quarantined, I'd rather it be in my own apartment.
Sure.
And so that sucks. And my family wants me to get out of here until the situation calms down. I can't say I blame them. So we'll see what happens. I might not. I might be departing Wuhan for a while, but we'll see what.
So you just don't know. You just don't know right now, basically. No. Yeah. Well, I guess doing things like these dialogues is just a good distraction. I mean, what else are you going to do? Sit there and worry all day? I mean, you may as well, I guess, carry on as best as you can and distract yourself. I know every time I'm in New York dealing with some horrible turn in my father's poor health, I want to do my work. It's just sort of like I'm just not thinking about and obsessing about the things I'm worried about. So, Spencer, wanted to talk about moral realism and put together a really very nice outline of topics. It is a subject on which he and I pretty much diametrically disagree upon. And I should say, Spencer, that the audience really liked our discussion, the last discussion, the first one we did. They liked the way we interacted. They liked the fact that we disagreed on quite a bit, and they liked the fact that we kind of were like thinking in real time, that it was not a very, very staged or prepared sort of thing. And so I'm really glad that you seem to be up to do more of these, and I'm really appreciative of
I should say, my girlfriend, who is also in Wuhan and is quarantined on the other side of the city.
Oh, God.
Yeah, exactly. I was talking to her using a Chinese social media app, and I said, yeah, I'm going on a podcast with another philosopher, and we really disagree. And she says, does that happen a lot in philosophy? It was like,
never.
Sweet summer child.
So yeah. Why don't you start off? I will ask you, though, to, however you start off, say just a few words about what you take moral realism to be, and then we can launch into. You can start into however you want to start into the topic.
Right. I think there's quite a lot to unpack just with the definition here. In fact, the one thing I want to begin with is the realism, anti-realism. That's a dichotomy, but we're talking about a range of views, like a range of possibilities. My dissertation advisor, Graham Oddie, in his book, I think it's called Value, Desire, Reality, or Value, Reality, Desire. I can never remember which sequence of those nouns it is. But he begins by giving like six levels of realism about value. And I think that's kind of the right way to think of it, is to think of it like sort of steps of increments of realism, rather than drawing some line in the sand where you're an anti-realist if you're over here and you're a realist if you're over here.
Well, maybe you could give a sketch of that, because it's not at all obvious to me how that would go, given how I think of realism. So why don't you go ahead and sketch that? All
right. So I recall Audie has at his lowest level, I'm not sure, maybe he calls it semantic realism, but this is basically cognitivism, right? So are moral statements meaningful, right? If I say the transatlantic slave trade was morally evil, is that a meaningful statement, right? And
as opposed to what, a sort of an emotivist treatment?
Something like that, yes.
Okay, so
yes.
As opposed to, let's say, sort of a boo-hurrah theory, like you get an air.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
So you say yes if you say no to that, that moral statements aren't even meaningful, then then you're a non-cognitivist. So if you say yes up to the next level, and then you say, okay, moral statements are meaningful, that in the sense of being truth apt, in the sense of they can be true or false. Are some of them non-trivially true, right? Are some of them true? So an error theorist now would say, yes, moral statements are meaningful, but no, none of them are true. Now there's some technical difficulties for this position that I think they have their ways of working out. Like, you have to say that if you define evil as not good or something, then you deny that something is not good. You assert that it's evil, but there are ways of sorting that out. So, in a non-trivial sense, are there some true moral statements? So, an error theorist says no. If you clear that bar, if you say yes, moral statements are meaningful, yes, some of them are true, non-trivially true, then you get to the third level. At that point, I would say this is what Massimo is calling objectivism. I would call it minimal realism. I think this is what Jeffrey Sear McCord says. So a minimal realist says that there are some moral truths, right? But when you say that you're a moral realist, you want to typically say more than that. But I actually think that the further criteria after this get extremely contentious and tricky when you dig into the details. So, for example, the third thing that you're supposed to meet to be a realist is you're supposed to say that some moral truths are mind independent. But I think it is quite tricky to spell out what is meant by mind independent in a way that's going to be acceptable. So, for example, one theory of value is hedonism. So according to hedonism, what's good is pleasure or happiness or states of the mind, right? And or the balance of pleasure over pain or something like that, depending on how you want to cash it out. Well, that's certainly mind dependent. But it seems like...
Wait a minute. The pleasure is...
The pleasure is.
But the goodness that is asserted to be the characteristic of the pleasure would not be then, right? I mean, in other words, I don't see why the fact that the pleasure is not mind independent doesn't mean that the goodness of it wouldn't be mind independent.
Is the goodness of it something independent of it itself? Like if we're just identifying the pleasure, the goodness with pleasure, it's weird to say the one is mind dependent, but the other isn't.
Well, look, I'm not a moral realist. I mean, I don't really have a skin in this, but I mean,
right.
I guess I just didn't think, and maybe I'm wrong about this. I guess I didn't think that moral realists had a particular problem with respect to the fact that neither a Kantian view, that both Kantian views and utilitarian views are very involve a lot of connection to mental states, right?
So that's exactly my point.
But I don't see why that is a problem for someone who wants to say that rightness and wrongness are mind independent properties. In other words, I don't see, because look, what you could say if you're a utilitarian is, pleasure is good, but all that saying it's good means is that a lot of people care about it, right? Now that would be a non-realist treatment of its goodness, right? In the way that I understand realism. But if a realist would say, well, no, I mean, yes, the pleasure is mind dependent, but its goodness is mind independent, right? That pleasure is good is a kind of like a Platonic truth, right?
That's one way you could go. That's one way you could go.
That's what I always thought a realist was somebody. And in that sense, it's supposed to be analogous to other forms of realism, like metaphysical realism. And that's why I thought it was useful for when Massimo and I discussed this to sort of distinguish between moral objectivism. So, a contractarian could say that values and obligations are objective in the sense that they're not just anybody's opinion, right? But they're not real in the realist sense because they don't exist independently of anybody's practices, right? They don't exist independently. So I guess I don't see why a realist should have any problem with the fact that pleasure is not mind independent.
Well, I don't think they should. I'm just saying that I think this may be a problem with the mind independence criterion as far as it needs to be spelled out more. Now, what you said about the goodness might be independent of the mind, but the pleasure isn't. That's one way a realist could go, and that's towards a kind of non-naturalism, which I actually favor. But I don't think you want to define realism in such a way that being a realist entails being a non-naturalist.
Well, it would seem to me that it would in morals, right? I mean, it wouldn't obviously with respect to the material world, right? I mean, but surely values belong to the manifest and not the scientific image, right? I mean, if there were no people, if there were no agents, if there were no actors in existence, then it's not as if the rocks and the space dust and the stars and all of that would have value, right? I mean those characteristics are the result of certain kinds of certain kinds of beings being there and certain kinds of relations being there, right? I mean, you're not suggesting that a universe in which there never evolved any actors would have moral characteristics, do you?
There'd be nothing morally significant. There would only be modal statements like, if there were beings in this universe, then you should...
right, but that's not interesting, though, right? I mean, that's not philosophically interesting.
I don't know. I mean, so let's back up about what this third...
Sure. I'm sorry. I'm just... Yeah, go ahead.
Let's back up about what this third criterion is supposed to do. What the moral realist wants to eliminate or rule out views that make basic moral truths, dependent on opinion or social construction. So my opinion is it's best to just say that and leave it at that, right? Rather than trying to spell out a positive sense of mind independence, which I think it gets you into. I mean, maybe it can be done, but I haven't quite seen anything that's satisfied me here. So if you want to say, for example, consider moral relativism. Now, this is clearly a view that realists are going to reject. The view that, yes, there are moral truths, so we're minimal realists, right? We meet the first two conditions. Moral statements are meaningful, some of them are true, but their truth is dependent on culture, right? Like what is good according to my culture is what's good morally. A realist is going to reject that. I'm going to reject that. But there's a sense in which you could say that there is a mind-independent norm by that theory, that if your culture says X, then X is good, right? So why doesn't that satisfy mind independence? You see what I mean?
Yeah, I guess, maybe ultimately this doesn't really matter. It's just sort of slicing things up in different ways that wind up being sort of extensionally equivalent. But I guess I kind of want to be able to distinguish between the non-moral realist, moral objectivist, right, and the full-blown Platonic sort of moral realist, right? I mean, I guess I think that's a useful distinction to make, and partly because, well, let me not go down that road. I think that's a useful distinction to be able to make. It sounds to me like you're just sort of happy to go as far as moral objectivist and then not go for much beyond that. The thing is that at least in terms of potential disagreements between us, a lot of my potential disagreements are not going to be at the objectivism. They're going to be at the realism. And so it may mean that we disagree about a lot less.
No, I do want to go beyond. I do want to go beyond minimal realism / objectivism. But I just want to point out that just saying like mind independence is the third thing. I think that opens up a whole set of problems that are usually not picked apart too finely. They tend to be sort of glossed over because I think a lot of these like paradigm, like if you define mind independence too strictly, you rule out like hedonism, which seems like it should be compatible with moral realism. But if you define it a little bit more broadly, suddenly it seems like all sorts of forms of subjectivism now get to be counted as realism. So I think there's a puzzle there in how to do that exactly correctly.
So go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm just going to say something a little bit less committal. And I'm going to sort of contrast moral facts with, say, facts about currency. I think this is a good contrast. So it is a truth that the U.S. dollar is currency, and it's currency accepted in the U.S. That's true. So that meets the first two conditions of realism, right? It's meaningful to say it, and it's true. And it's empirically true. You just notice that, you go to a store and you give them dollars and they'll give you goods.
Right.
But this is dependent on human convention, right, in a pretty obvious way.
It is.
Because crash, China could buy the U.S. and now we're all using yuan or something. or something, or the Treasury and the Federal Reserve could declare we're going to do something else now. We're all going to Bitcoin, and then it wouldn't be true anymore. And so I think what the realist is really after is moral facts are not contingent upon those sorts of decisions, right? There's no moral board anywhere who can make a vote and say, okay, we're going to make slavery morally right next week, but only for 1 week or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's really what the moral realist is after, I think.
Yeah, I'm wondering though if that's going to work. I mean, I mean whether that's a viable way of characterizing it, not whether it's correct, but sort of because I can think of any number. I can think of several, certainly moral objectivists, but in one case, a flat out moral realist who does think that obligations and duties are contingent upon circumstances, right? And so Aristotle's certainly a moral objectivist, although not a moral realist. And although you could maybe argue he's a moral realist because of his teleological view of human nature, but let's just not get into all that for now. He's certainly a moral objectivist, but Aristotle famously doesn't think that any action is intrinsically right or wrong. It's entirely dependent on the circumstances and whether relative to the circumstances it constitutes moderation, right? And that will change. The very same action maybe suffer maybe a vice of deficiency on Tuesday, a moderate on Wednesday, and a vice of excess on Thursday, depending on what else is going on. So that's sort of one thing that I would sort of be concerned about. And then someone like W.G. Ross, who is a moral realist, very famously thinks that we have any number of prima facie duties, but what our actual duty is in any given set of circumstances depends entirely on which prima facie duty is more pressing in those circumstances, right? And so I just don't see why a moral objectivist or a moral realist needs to reject the idea that obligation, duty, etc., may be dependent upon or contingent upon people, circumstances, and all that sort of thing.
Yeah. So I think there's a confusion that's introduced into this whole discussion with the word absolute and absolutism, which is ambiguous. So absolute can mean not dependent on anything else or something like that, or it can mean uncompromising, unyielding. I don't see any reason why there couldn't be like a moral reality in a strong, even Platonic sense, but a moral reality that's sensitive to circumstances and allows lots of different considerations to be taken into effect. Like, I don't think that if there's a moral reality and there is a moral reason not to lie, that means that you can't lie no matter what the circumstances are. So
I thought you just said that you just defined it in terms of not being contingent upon human decisions. You were comparing it to the case of the money, right? Well, the money is a standard of currency, relative to these sets of agreements. But if those change, and at least both Aristotle and Ross, you could tell a very similar story about obligations and duties, right? This is a duty unless these people over there are doing this and think that, and the circumstances are such that this is happening down the street, and da-da-da-da-da. I don't see the relevant difference between that and the money case.
The relevant difference is you don't have the Federal Reserve saying, okay, we're going to set the weights for the prima facie duties differently today or something like that. Right.
Yeah, but that's a non-essential difference, right? I mean, I thought I didn't think the point hung on the Federal Reserve. I thought that the point hung upon the fact that the idea of this being contingent upon agreements, about social agreements and human decisions, and all of that would be the case in with both Aristotle and Ross. They're both moral objectivists, and one of them is also a moral realist in the stronger sense. I'm not necessarily arguing with you. I'm just because I'm not thinking that you've quite got the right characterization. I mean, I agree with you that mind independence is a whole clusterfuck of problems. But I'm not sure that non-contingent upon human decisions or whatever is going to work. I'm wondering whether you have to sort of play with this a little bit.
No, I see the point. I think it's got to be something like the most basic kind of normative moral entities. Those are not contingent, but like, so for example, if utilitarianism is true, the principle of utility, let's just say it's maximizing utilitarianism, because it's the principle that you should maximize utility whenever you can, however you can. That is not going to be dependent on any kind of human decision. But then things that humans do are going to determine what will actually maximize utility, right? So there, at that level, there is going to be a kind of dependence on what humans do, what humans say.
Okay, I'm not going to die on this hill. I mean, I don't want to peck you to death. I just sort of thought to myself, well, wait a minute, I want to make sure that we're not missing something obvious. But
at some
it's
point,
fine.
I want to sit down and do a paper on just what is the mind independence criterion supposed to be for moral realism. I kind of spelled out a bit of these problems at the beginning of my dissertation and largely punted on it because it's not being discussed widely as being a problem. It's sort of like, oh, we all sort of know well enough what mind independence is supposed to be. But it does seem to me that you dig down into the details and it gets pretty thorny pretty quickly.
Yeah. Listen, I have a problem with mind independence even on the side of metaphysics. I mean, I find many of the metaphysical anti-realist arguments quite persuasive. And despite the fact, in addition, that I'm not a metaphysical monist, so I'm a metaphysical pluralist. So they're further pumped, and that's actually going to come into play, I think, with what we're going to wind up talking about eventually, and that is that one of my reasons for not being a moral realist isn't the queerness argument that you get in Mackey, which we'll get to down the road. But and that's because I don't think there's anything queer about something that's not a natural or physical property, since I'm a metaphysical pluralist. So, but anyway, why don't you continue on from where we are? So let's just bracket this question about the precise formulation of contingent upon human whatever, and just sort of, you don't want to go mind independence because you think it's a nest of vipers. You'd rather do something along the lines of non-contingent or necessary or something like that, in some way or the other. I guess we'll just put it that way, right? So anyway, so go on.
So once you've got the mind independence or whatever it is, what that criterion spelled out, at that point you get into what I would think of as ecumenical disagreements within realism, right? And I don't have a whole lot to say about those. So, for example, are you a naturalist or not is the big division. I tend to, and what is naturalism? Now we could go there. But naturalism means one, I think the most general thing it's supposed to mean is that the truth makers of moral facts, the things that make moral statements true, are not metaphysically different from the kinds of truths discoverable by the natural sciences. I think that's basically it. But again, if you probe on what is a natural property exactly, you get into a whole other thicket of questions, no less complicated than the ones we were just discussing.
Well, let me ask you something about that.
Sure.
This is tricky stuff. So, I mean, it almost starts to me to sound like you're sort of going to be forced to saying that moral realism is an empirically demonstrable position, right? Whereas, the standard realisms, right? No one is going to say metaphysical realism is an empirically verifiable position, right? But if you're not going to say that one can be an entirely naturalistic moral realist, or by naturalistic, I'm assuming you mean some sort of a materialism or physicalism. That is an ontological, a metaphysical monism, right? Then isn't that going to wind up making moral realism an empirical theory?
The naturalist makes the moral realism an empirical theory?
Yeah, if one allows for a completely naturalistic or / materialistic moral realism, then aren't you in the weird position of having to say that moral realism, which I thought was a metaphysical thesis, is actually an empirical one?
That's interesting. There are these arguments. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Nicholas Sturgeon's work.
Sure, of course I am.
Yeah. And then Michael Humer, who is on my committee, has got a similar argument. I actually don't find these sorts of arguments persuasive, but there's one kind of argument says the best explanation for certain kinds of social progress is that we're in touch with some kind of moral reality. Whereas I'm inclined to think, given that I am a realist on other grounds, that's how I'm going to interpret social progress, like abolitionism. I think reason had some role to do with people's recognition that slavery was immoral, other things like that. But I don't think you can start from a position of not being a moral realist and then look at those developments and then find a persuasive argument for moral realism there.
But the thing is, you think that if you're suggesting that rightness and wrongness and obligatoriness and prohibitedness can be natural properties, then it seems to me that any statements about them are going to be, in other words, I don't see, it seems to me that nothing, if anything is a priori, it's something like moral realism, right? But now I'm wondering if it is. And then I'm also wondering how you're going to run an account of realism that has it being non-contingent, right?
So I don't know.
This is too abstract and tricky, but these are the things that are occurring to me as you're sort of talking through this.
I think a naturalist would want to say something like, and it would depend on what kind of naturalist we're talking about, et cetera. I think a naturalist would have to concede that in principle they're empirically can be investigated through the sciences, but in practice, doing that would be extremely complicated. To be able to look at a set of physical facts and infer some moral fact would be just beyond our technological capabilities, though it is in principle possible. I think a moral naturalist might. Does
that seem right to you, though?
No,
you're not a moral naturalist, right?
No.
Okay, so there's no reason to fight this one out. Yeah. My reaction to you is more that I'm somewhat surprised that there is such a position.
Uh-huh.
In other words, because it seems to me it would entail all sorts of things that are just clearly either wrong or just a mess, right? You'd have to countenance, for example, natural properties that are not in some ways empirically verifiable, right? But I don't know. I would say that I would argue that that something like natural property is a thick concept that includes things like empirically verifiable, right? That's part of what makes it natural, as opposed to a non-natural fact like, the Pythagorean theorem or go ahead.
I'm not a naturalist.
No, I know you're not. Yeah.
I'm not the ideal person to be defending the naturalist here.
Yeah.
But I want to make sure we're not giving the naturalist short shrift. And so I want to put this forward on behalf of the naturalist. Consider the badness of pain. Is that empirically verifiable? Well, maybe it is, right?
I don't see how it would be unless you define the badness in terms of what matters to people, right? If you're going to, but then that's not realism anymore. That's subjectivism.
Well, I'm suggesting that kind of value realism might not be a problem, or that kind of dependency might not be a problem for the realist, or at least.
So now you can be a moral subjectivist and a moral realist at the same time?
I don't think it's subjectivism to say that pain is bad. Right?
To say that badness only exists relative to people for whom pain matters, that strikes me as being non-realist. I mean, I've never heard anyone describe someone like an emotivist or like a Humean sentimentalist as being a moral realist. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that.
No, that's right. That's right. But a hedonistic utilitarian, I think, could be a realist. Although you might say, well, the issue there is not the value, but the obligation claim that you ought to maximize the value or something like that. But it does seem like just stick with the value claim for a minute.
Sure.
It does seem.
You can tell me whatever you don't want to litigate. Just tell me, and I'll drop it. You know what I mean? That's fine.
It does seem to me that it makes sense to say, like, yeah, I've experienced putting my hand on the stove once, and it was pain, and it was bad. That seems like you can verify the badness of pain through each experience of it, and. Pain, that pain is bad. Like an instance of pain is, of course.
But to the extent that the badness implies some sort of ought, that is the normativity of it, I don't see how that could come from a purely natural account. Yeah. So
this gets to other questions about the relationship between value and normativity, which is quite fraught. So it seems like there's some kind of relation there. It seems like if I recognize that something is bad, I ought to be able to deduce from that I've got some kind of reason to avoid it or not promote it or something.
It seems to me that normativity is the whole game. Without normativity, the whole discourse is pointless, it seems to me. And that's why I'm very inclined to think that, if you can't make sense of the normativity, then you're just going to, and look, this is Anscombe's view, right? I feel like modern ethicists should have to read and recite Anscombe's Modern Moral Philosophy every morning, as a part of, to remind themselves, the hills that they haven't climbed yet, and that they can't just help themselves to all sorts of assumptions.
I read it a couple of times, although it's been years. And I found it like extremely polemical and rhetorical, and
I think it's completely devastating. I don't think any modern moral philosophy survives it. I think it's one of a handful of the most devastating critiques of an entire school and of an entire framework.
I see nothing impressive about it. I found nothing impressive about it.
I will say that the weight of history seems to be on your side. However, I would very strongly suggest that it's simply because nobody's good enough to actually answer the challenges. And they just figure that if they ignore it long enough, people will forget about it and they can carry on. But it's one of the reasons why I take almost no modern moral theorizing very seriously, because I just don't think the fundamental questions and challenges she asked and challenges she posed have been in any way adequately answered. And that has to do precisely with the matter of normativity, as well as having to do with the idea of human nature. A lot of the arguments I'm going to pose are going to be, straightforwardly Anscomian arguments. That essay that I had you to read about prescription and force, that's all inspired by Anscombe. I just don't think any of the imperatives that anybody from any of the moral philosophies utters has any normative force whatsoever. It has what Anscombe calls mesmeric force. It has force only as kind of like a fiction. But the minute you push on it, the whole thing dissolves, and you just realize that all you're doing is listening to other people tell you what they want. Right.
I find myself in very strong disagreement, but perhaps
sure you do. But until you can actually show me the force.
Okay.
It's just talk. It's just talk, man.
Maybe we can agree on this one point then, which is I think there's how to define moral realism, but we haven't yet said much about why this debate matters, why it's important.
Sure, go ahead. Tell me what. Go explain why you think it matters.
I think that what we're really responding to isn't the desire to have some kind of metaphysical fact or something like that undergirding our moral statements, but the whole idea of normative force, normative authority, normativity, like we really ought to do the things we morally ought to do. There's a sense among many realists, myself included, that you can't really capture that. You can't really make sense of the importance of our normative discourse, normative practices, our commitments to ethics without making the most fundamental ethical truths not dependent on individual desire or social construction in some way. So I really think authority, the authority of morality, really is what this whole debate is about.
Right.
And there are some people who seem to think that who treat moral realism and metaethics as being this higher order question. Like, you've got all of our first order normative practices. So the common sense morality you and I would agree with and adhere to mostly in everyday life, like don't lie, don't steal, don't kill, and can say like, wow, that's terrible when you hear about a serial killer or something like that. So there's the first order ordinary discourse, which I think you agree with me that you're not like wanting to abandon or give up. And then there's this thought then there's this higher level dollop of metaphysical weirdness on top that is dispensable, and why would we bother with that? I don't know if I would accept the first part. I mean, I kind of do want to give it up. Okay.
Actually, the essay Prescription, Reason, and Force, one of the things I said is I really wouldn't mind at all if people just stopped using the word should, for a lot. Because I find nothing compelling about it. When people tell me all these things I should do, I always ask why, and then I find myself chasing kind of down a rabbit hole of answers, none of which is any more persuasive than the previous one. And it's actually worth noting that, there's not just normativity within the moral frame of reference. Normativity is shot through. Normative notions are shot throughout philosophy. Justification is a normative notion, right? Justification is if something is justified, then you ought to believe it, right? Truth is a normative notion, and so I find what I'm increasingly aware of is that we're sort of swimming in a sea of shoulds. And I've yet to ever hear a compelling case made for what the force of those shoulds is supposed to be.
Yeah. So
other than that somebody wants something from me or wants me to do something, or which I might be sympathetic to or not. But I find that what you just described, that authority, I just find to me is a kind of con game.
That's so.
The people who don't feel like negotiating anymore now try to act as if the thing that they want carries some great force with it, such that it's not this that I want you to do it, but in some sense you have to do it, right? I find moral talk more often than not an excuse on the part of people who don't want to negotiate anymore, who don't want to have to compromise, who don't want to have to settle for the fact that they might actually lose the negotiation, or that they might lose whatever it is the disagreement is about.
Yeah. So if I say,
aha, there's this special magic power. It's called normative force of ethics, right? And you ought to do it. And if you're not, you're a capital bad person. If I just don't care about any of that, it has no force at all, right? I mean, it's just talk.
No, it's not just talk. Is it just talk to say, don't be a rapist? Being a rapist is bad. You shouldn't be a rapist. Is that just talk, or does that say something true about?
I think you're engaging in manipulative rhetoric.
I don't think so.
I do, because of the example you chose. Because of the example you chose. You're playing on. You're trying to get me to say something that's now going to make me look terrible because of the kind of example that you chose. That's highly charged sort of
reality. We're talking about the kind of reality that makes rape and genocide and enslavement and mass murder wrong. So if you want to say that,
I think they're horrible, but wrong has a very different connotation, right? Wrong implies.
By horrible, do you mean I really ought not to do them?
Meaning I find them horrible. I mean, no. I mean,
that's not what I'm asking. I ought not to do
Right,
them.
but my point is that I have yet to see an account of the alleged force that these judgments have. That's
What do you want?
That's persuasive.
What are you looking for? Are you looking for something that I can say that will like? It seems to me like a lot of Humeans just want to like collapse normativity with like motivation. Like if I don't want to do it, I don't.
That's right. That's right.
Well, then
faces don't change anything, right? I mean, you can make all the faces you want. It's not an answer, right?
Well, you haven't given me an objection. You haven't given me.
But the burden's not on me. I'm just asking you. What is the force of these propositions? Now, look, I understand what the force is.
What do you mean by force? Do you mean
a divine command view? The compelling force that goes beyond you simply caring about it.
Normative force?
Yes. What compelling force does it have beyond the fact that somebody cares about it?
The fact that it's wrong?
That's just question begging.
Well, it's question begging for you not to acknowledge that as a possibility.
Yeah, I just don't see that.
Okay. So let's consider this.
I mean, I can run through Anscombe's arguments and explain why in our current frame of reference, why there is no foundation or grounds for the force that these judgments are supposed to have, right?
I've read your whole essay on this a couple of times, and you just don't consider moral realism as a possibility, and say, if somebody says you ought to do something, that's just a kind of way of forcing them to do something. But like that's not normativity. That's just the rejection of the view I hold, not an argument against it. Right? Like consider this.
Yeah, I don't get it.
Consider this. You're no doubt familiar with the Ring of Gyges case from Book 2 of the Republic. So this is a case of, I don't know whether I'm saying it right, Gyges or whatever. But so the shepherd in the service of the king of Lydia finds a ring that makes him invisible. And then the invisibility, what that is supposed to symbolize is being able to escape the social sanctions that are associated with immoral behavior. So then Glaucon is presenting this to Socrates in the context of the Republic to push Socrates to defend his view that justice is both instrumentally good and good for its own sake. So he gives the story of this guy who has this power that makes him exempt from all sorts of moral sanctions. And how does he use it? He kills the king, sleeps with the queen, makes himself king, and then Glaucon says, well, and of course, he would take whatever he wanted. He would have sex with whoever he wanted. And he's clearly referring to rape there, because I don't think he means that like every woman is going to be so impressed with his ability to turn invisible. So he becomes a rapist and a murderer. And Glaucon says, well, everyone would do this basically. And why not? There's no penalty associated with it. And then Socrates' actual answer, like that's such an interesting thought experiment. And the answer says like, well, in order to understand justice in the individual case and the disorder it causes in the soul, we're going to need to consider justice in the political case. And that makes me think, oh no, like if we have to solve politics before we answer this question, like we're never going to get to the answer to this question. But I present this thought experiment to my students. I don't ask them if who among you would behave like Gyges, because it would in this example, because I don't want to know. But it seems like a lot of people do have the intuition that like, yes, he really shouldn't do it, even though he could get away with it. And I add this one further tweak. The further tweak is Suppose that Gyges, the ring of Gyges, allows Gyges not even to feel guilty for whatever crimes he commits, because that's a sanction too. It's an internal sanction.
That's right.
And the purpose of the ring, the purpose of the ring in the story is it's not about just avoiding punishment like criminal punishment. It's to avoid all instrumental features of morality. So you just have morality itself, right? So Gyges has the ring. He has the ability to avoid even internal sanctions associated with immoral behavior. And yet I want to say he ought not rape people. And I can at least make sense of that assertion. And I think it's also true that one who is similarly able to escape the consequences of immoral behavior just shouldn't behave immorally for no other reason than that it is immoral. I think that's completely comprehensible. And I think it's true with regard to certain categories of behavior.
Yeah, I just don't find that persuasive at all. I mean, first of all, I don't see why someone has to be a moral realist to not want to do what Gyges does. I certainly wouldn't want to do what Gyges does, but I don't see why that has to make me a moral realist. And you oughtn't to do X because, and when I ask, well, why not? Well, because X is immoral. I find that an empty gesture. That doesn't really mean anything to me. It's certainly not persuasive. It's certainly not the case that if I wasn't already inclined against doing whatever the thing was, that I would suddenly become inclined because you told me that. I certainly wouldn't. The reason that I wouldn't behave this way is because behaving that way would make me feel sick, right? I mean, I would feel terrible. I would have pity for the people that I was hurting, and I would feel terrible that I'd done it. I don't see why any of that requires me to be a moral realist. It just requires me to have emotions. If I wasn't so inclined, that's why I find the question really I find the whole discussion rather pointless and even somewhat silly, because the real question is, if one was confronted with a person who was not already so inclined, what would it add to tell them that it's, oh, by the way, it's immoral on top of it? I understand you don't care about it. I understand you don't feel that way. I understand you have no sympathy, but it's immoral. If I was that person, I'd just laugh at you, right? I mean, I'd be like, and what's that supposed to mean to me?
Yeah, but I mean, do you think that the task of the moral realist is to convince Jeffrey Dahmer to be a good person?
No, I think the task of the moral realist is to explain to me what is added by saying that beyond, I really wish you wouldn't do that, right? Or I really wish that you would do that. I don't know what's added. And the way to test or the way to push that question is to imagine saying it to somebody who was not already so inclined, right? That's why I think that the moral discourse, for the most part, is simply designed to try to give an air of necessity or objectivity to something in a situation where one is confronted with someone who's not already inclined to do what one wishes, right? And so then one sort of tries to give it the imprimatur of a kind of objective necessity that it doesn't really have. And I think it would have no efficacy at all on a person who was not already emotionally inclined in that direction. That's why I agree with Anscombe that these judgments, these statements, really only have mesmeric force. They don't have any real force. And Philippa Foot said something very similar. She said,
"Yeah, in the 1972 paper, she abandoned, right?"
But we're not doing biography. I think she was wrong to abandon it. I think that was right. The fact that she abandoned it has nothing to do with whether it's correct or not. Unless we're just doing history of ideas. I'm not doing history of ideas. I'm trying to figure out what I think is the right position. And I agree entirely with Philippa Foot when she said that people seem to think that these statements have some sort of internal power or force, but they don't. The only force they have is either in the inclination that the person already feels in the direction that one is exhorting the person towards, or in the belief in some framework in which there's going to be some sanction of some sort, which again only works because people care about the sanctions, right? The rest of it just strikes me as just illusory. I mean, it's just not, doesn't move me at all. If I'm not already inclined towards something and somebody says to me, well, you really ought to, that doesn't move me 1 inch. Not at all.
It doesn't have to. It doesn't have to.
But then it's used, then it's pointless. It's just empty talk.
It's not empty.
I think the sole purpose of ethics is practical.
Okay, how about this?
Ethics is a practical discipline. It's not metaphysics.
How about this? I think we might. Okay, so
the purpose of obligation discourse is to get people to do things and not to do other things. If it fails to do that, there's no point to the discourse.
You get them to do the things they should do. Not right.
That begs the question, because I'm denying that there's such a thing as a should do beyond a want to do.
Okay. All right. Well, here, let me give you this one further example.
Sure.
This one further thing.
I'm not sure what you seem annoyed, but I'm not sure what you expected, because you knew this was my view to begin with, right? I mean,
yeah, I do.
And it's not like I'm some weird guy that woke up thinking this. I mean, there is an entire school of thought that thinks this way, right? I mean, including some very serious
philosophers including
some very serious people who are not Hitler, right? David Hume is not Hitler, and so I just, I'm surprised that you seem surprised.
No, not really. Hear this out.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So Sarah Stroud made, but just to make it absolutely clear what the disagreement is, and then we'll come back to this.
Sure.
Sarah Stroud makes this distinction that I refer to in a couple of my papers, which is between what she calls genuinely authoritative reasons and domain relative reasons, or D reasons. A moral reason is an example of a genuinely authoritative reason for her. And she gives this example, but here's an example of a domain relative reason, like just stipulate that there's some domain events. Stipulate that there's some domain events. And so she gives the example of social climbing. Like, you might want to social climb. You might want to get higher up the social ladder. But she might not. She might not care. She might not care to associate with a bunch of rich snobs, right? So suppose that she's in that category. She has no compelling moral reason or compelling practical reason to be a social climber. And so all of the things that she ought to do as a social climber are immaterial to her. Like, she can just completely ignore them. I like to give this example.
If all you're doing is sort of pointing to the distinction between hypothetical and categorical imperatives. Maybe.
Hear this out. Take the example of your least favorite politician. Your least favorite politician. I don't need to know who it is.
Donald Trump.
Okay, Donald Trump. That works great. Right. So suppose that we define that Trump-related reasons are all the reasons that you have that are relative to the end of promoting the career of Donald Trump. Now, I would agree with you there that those reasons have absolutely no normative force. Right? They're for two reasons. You have no practical reason, you have no end or interest in promoting them, and you don't have any authoritative reason to promote that end, namely promoting his career. So let's say that's true. Certainly not for its own sake, you don't. Okay, so those are mere D reasons. Now, do you acknowledge there's a distinction between completely arbitrary reasons like that, like Trump promotion reasons, and moral reasons, like you shouldn't commit genocide, you shouldn't kill people?
I don't believe there are any categorical imperatives that can actually be cashed out. No.
So you want to say that moral reasons are just like D reasons, but like more people buy into.
I agree with Aristotle in that what distinguishes a moral reason from another one is simply its subject matter, not its force.
Okay. I think moral reasons are distinguished by their force.
Right. I don't. And I don't think that the notion of force you want to work with can be cashed out in any possible way in the modern framework. That's why I think Anscombe's so important. You could cash it out in the Abrahamic tradition, right? You could cash it out when you combine the Abrahamic tradition with the sort of the teleologically thick version of human nature that you get out of Aristotle. But on a modern view of human nature, on a sort of a basically stripped down materialist biological account of human nature, and in the absence of divine commands, I think that all you've got are sort of racial memory of normativity that we illegitimately apply in a discourse that no longer has the conceptual resources to sustain it or support it. So I don't think they have any force at all. I think that you just live under the illusion that they do, and that you discover this every time you run up against a person, right, who just is not already inclined in that direction and is just utterly unmoved by your constant shoulds, oughts, and musts, right? And then they just say, well, no, I shouldn't.
Do you think there would be such force if God existed and there were divine commands?
Yes.
Why?
Because of God, because God's overwhelmingly coercive power. That's why.
Okay.
I don't know what other kind of force there could be, right? I mean,
whew, boy, wow. Because my first philosophy teacher referred to divine command theory as the God as mafia boss theory.
That's what I think it is.
Well, I agree, but the fact that
I don't see how else you get force out of something. I don't know what it even means otherwise, other than somebody making somebody do something, making somebody do something.
Okay, but I mean, if you really don't understand, and I have met a few other philosophers who say they just don't understand what normativity means, but that's not an objection to the concept. That I don't understand it is not an objection to it. I understand it.
I don't really care to object to it. It has no effect on me. You can walk around thinking that your utterances have all this force. What difference does it make to me? I don't think they have any.
My utterances have all this force.
Well, the moral ones. The moral ones.
No, I don't think my moral utterances have this force because I don't see the purpose of moral discourse as coercive. I'm a cognitivist. I think I'm trying to describe a reality that's out there.
Yeah, I think the only purpose, I think ethics is 100% a practical discipline. I don't think it has any purely understanding aims. I think the purpose of moral discourse is to try to get people to do certain things and to get them not to do other things. That's the point of it. Otherwise, I don't see. It's not science. It's not. The point of it is not. I am not interested. I mean, yes, you could do ethics for the purpose of hanging signs around people's necks. That's okay. That's the bad one. That's the good one. I just find that completely absent of any interest. Right. I understand why I want to know things scientifically, but I don't really have any sense of why I would want to know those other things other than for the practical purpose of trying to get people to do some things and just not do others.
Curious.
I'm also not the only person. It's not like I'm the only person who thinks that ethics is a practical discipline, right? I mean, I understand my view is not the majority view, but it's not some wild thing I just woke up thinking. I mean,
no, and you're not the only one who has this kind of skepticism of normativity. There have been a number of other philosophers I've talked to, although I have to say I've also talked to many anti-realists, including error theorists, who at least understand what I mean by this force and just think that it by normative force, and then think for like independent metaphysical reasons that it doesn't exist. But let me see. I wanted to ask.
So could you say what the force is, what it actually consists of?
Well, here's the thing, is I think that normativity is one of these concepts where there's not that, it's close to being a primitive concept. If it's not a primitive concept, it's close to being one. So it's very difficult to spell it out non-circularly. So this puts you in a bad dialectical situation when you encounter a skeptic. It's like how would you respond to a skeptic of consciousness? You're having an argument about the philosophy of mind, and you've got some error theorist here who says consciousness. I have no idea what you mean.
Well, this happens all the time. I mean, Dan Dennett has built an entire career on saying that consciousness is an illusion, right? I guess, I don't know. I mean, what I usually do is just ignore those people or laugh at them or something. I don't really, fortunately, there just are there really are no stakes, right? And so, if people want to believe crazy, silly things, that's fine. Good for them. I thought what I thought you were going to do was go in a different direction, and invoke external world skepticism. But I wrote an entire paper explaining why I don't think moral skepticism is anything like external world. Moral skepticism, I think, is very grounded, practical. There are very substantial reasons for it. External world skepticism is almost entirely formal. It's based on almost entirely formal grounds. It's not really because the fact that somebody can experience an optical illusion causes them to lose confidence in the general reliability of their senses. It has to do with structural gaps in the logic of justification and stuff like that. But there's a fuck ton of very substantial, very ordinary, commonsensical reasons to be morally skeptical. One of the things I'd say in that paper on moral skepticism is that, the only reason for believing there are any moral properties at all is because of people's performances, right? There's no other evidence of it. The problem is that people's performances, and especially their moral performances, are so often so disingenuous, self-serving, manipulative, etc., that I don't think one has to be, a conspiratorial type to really not to be pretty wary of it. So I don't see any evidence for the existence of any morality beyond people's performances, right? I mean, it's not like science. It's not like, I can set up a telescope and, there's Jupiter over there, or, I can, all I got is people saying things, telling people to do things and not to do things, right? That's it. That's all there is, right?
I'm not primarily interested in telling other people to do things, although I will say what I think is right about that. I'm interested in making sense of my own internal sense that there are ways that I ought to behave. And for me, it's first personal, right? I really have a strong desire to do what's right and to discover what's right as best I can, and including if that means making significant sacrifices, including if that means putting myself in a position where my peers don't agree with me, et cetera, et cetera. I'm trying to make sense of that.
You see, it's funny. I don't know, maybe this just has to do with the wildly different backgrounds you come from. I just don't think about my life that way at all. I mean, I do all sorts of things for people. But if you ask me why, my answer wouldn't invoke morality. It'd be because I care about them, right? Why did I help somebody? Well, they needed help, and I cared enough about them to want to give it to them, right? I just don't spend any time at all, wondering about my moral standing. I care about people and certain things and certain issues, and I have feelings of sympathy and pity and disgust, and I just don't see really what's added. Part of my problem with the moral framework is I just don't think it adds anything substantial. I think everything it adds is kind of illusory, manipulative. It's what I do. It's what I pull out when I can't get people to do what I want, and they won't compromise, and they won't negotiate with me. So now I got out the moral hammer, right? Now we get the big guns out. I just don't see any point. I don't see what it adds otherwise, the discourse. I just don't see what it adds to anything. I went and I catered someone's bat mitzvah for free. Why did I do that? I did that because they're members of my community. Their son grew up with my daughter. I care about them, and they have no money, and I want them to be happy on that day. And so I catered their bar mitzvah for free. I don't know what's added to that. What is added when I say, oh, and I was obligated to do so?
Well, you may not have been obligated.
I think nothing is, well, but to say, if we take charity as an obligation, right?
What's added is all of moral reality.
Huh?
What's added is all of moral reality.
Yeah, but
right?
that's just, again, talk. What actually substantially is added?
I told you. But let me try this from a different angle.
You just seem to think that means something to everyone, and I just don't. I don't see why you think that.
It means something to many of us. But anyway, let me try this from a different angle. Are you willing to say, like, you take practical, hypothetical reasons seriously, right?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
You mean like means ends reasoning? Of course.
Yeah. Say a little more about that, please.
Yeah. What do you mean? No, but what do you want me to say? I mean, other than that I believe in means end reasoning, of course.
Yeah. What I mean is, it seems like it's not analytic to say, like, Dan has a desire for X or to do X or let X be some aim, and Dan has a reason to do that, right? There's those seem not analytic, right? There's some further thing that's being added with the reason claim there, I think.
Could you give me a specific, let's do a specific example of an action and a reason.
Okay, how about you want to go to the movie theater tonight. The only way to get to the movie theater is to take the bus at 7 p.m. Therefore, you should take the bus at 7 p.m. Right. Do you have any problem with that kind of inference?
No.
I don't either. But note, you're still adding something. Somebody could say, well, what is all this hypothetical reasons talk? Can't we just spell out everything in terms of Dan's first-order desires that Dan wants to, therefore he does?
Yes, I could. If you asked me to sort of talk through that and explain that, I would say, well, I conceive of going to the mall as a good.
Okay. Do you
otherwise the reason would not make my behavior intelligible, right? I mean, it's only relative to my conceiving of that end as a good that the reason is in any way illuminating or of my behavior or in any way renders my behavior more intelligible, right? But to think of the end as a good is simply for it to matter to me, right?
Yeah, but do you want to say something like, if something matters to you, you should pursue it?
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say that pursuing it is part of what's meant by something mattering to you. I would say that mattering is thick.
But maybe mattering is too much. You're building too much in with that term. Maybe we just say.
I don't see why. It's an ordinary language, perfectly normal word that we use all the time in precisely this way.
We're in some technical discourse here, and so now maybe it's a little bit, things get a little fuzzy. Like, could we just say, could you just substitute the term desire for mattering here?
I just think that mattering is broader. I don't think it's always going to be something that can be characterized in terms of desire. In other words, I think you can get these kinds of practical schemas that operate beyond the sort of the belief desire grammar. So to me, matter, that something is a good means that it matters to someone. To me, is the broadest, sort of easiest, most natural, least stilted, least dependent upon unexplained and uncashed out concepts way of describing what it is to represent something as a good.
Okay. Well, here's
and by the way, in the absence of something like an Aristotelian teleological account of nature, I don't think there is any other way to characterize what we mean by representing something as a good.
Okay.
And I agree with Mill in that regard. Mill says pretty much as much. That's part of the reason that's half of Anscombe's argument. That once you lose the teleologically thick account of human nature, you lose a certain way of describing human behavior that's axiologically thick, and that then supports all sorts of axiologically thick judgments. I would say in a modern framework, you can't really even say, I promise to do such and such. What you really have to say, if you're speaking strictly and not begging the question, is I uttered certain sounds that had that have a certain conventional significance in common usage, yada 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 yada. I think a lot of ethical talk today just smuggles in a whole bunch of stuff that you're entitled to in a pre-modern framework, but you're not entitled to in a post-scientific revolutionary framework. McIntyre feels the same way. I mean, that's the whole point of After Virtue, right? I mean, that in a sense.
Here's where I was going.
I think you're playing a game that you're engaged in a discourse, employing concepts that in the modern framework you don't get to use.
Okay. Well,
without begging the question.
Let me bracket that. Bracket that. Go back to what I was driving at.
Sure.
I noted at the beginning of my paper on error theory, which I sent you, the AJP article, and something that's occurred to me for a while is that very few people are willing to go all the way on normative skepticism. I think I met one person at a conference once, but you look at Mackey.
Right.
He's okay with subjective value. It's objective value that he has a problem with. You look at, any number of people who are moral skeptics. Richard Joyce is another example. Jonas Olson, Stan Hussey. I can go down the list. And they all are sort of okay with instrumental reasons.
Well, I'm okay with instrumental reasons, and I have no problem with subjective value. That's what something mattering to somebody is a subjective value, right?
So, okay, but this is the thing I find puzzling, which is once normativity is in the door, whether it's hypothetical or not. I mean, this seems to me like the biggest leap here is do you let any normativity in the door? Once you admit that, yes, there are truths about what I ought to do practically. Forget about morality, just practically. It seems like you've already let normativity in the door, so why not?
Well, I accept the idea. I accept the ideas of. I accept the notion of a hypothetical imperative. So, to the extent to which it involves an ought, I certainly accept oughts. But if you ask me, well, can you cash out the force of that ought? I can, right? And the story I'm going to tell is going to be a story about my personal investment in the outcome, right? That, and whatever the end is, that this is a hypothetical imperative too, right? And so I'm going to tell a story about why I care about the end, relative to which these means are then something that I should do. My problem with the categorical imperative is there's no way to tell that kind of a story. You have to come up with some other way of characterizing, of filling in what the normativity consists in. Right? I can easily answer that in the case of a hypothetical imperative. What I'm saying is you can't answer it in the case of a categorical imperative.
Can you imagine the case of somebody who is so self-loathing that they don't desire what's in their own best interest? Not even
sure.
at the level.
I guess so. I mean, I guess I could imagine such a person.
Okay.
Whether such a person is actually empirically realistic,
I don't know.
I have no idea. But yes,
I don't know either.
I can imagine reading a story about such a person. Yes.
Just let me run with this for a second.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, suppose there's such a person who does not care about his own best interest, right? He doesn't care about it. It still seems to me that you could say, but look, your interest really is to be healthy and mentally well and to have friends and all of this stuff. You could truthfully say to that person, okay, so it seems like if that's right, there are truths about this person's own interest that are independent of his present desires, right?
I only think interests are intelligible relative to a person whose interest they are.
Okay, they are this person's interest. It is true that it's his interest.
Well, it's not. It's relative to your interests.
Well, let's say I'm that person. Let's say I'm the kind of person. I'm not, but let's just say that I'm the kind of person who doesn't value his own future well-being. It still seems to me that you could truthfully say of me that you ought to take measures to see that you're happy in the future. You ought to take measures to make sure that you're well in the future, whether you desire it or no.
No.
Okay.
No. The way I would frame that, I mean, if I was talking to such a person is, and I do. I mean, I have to talk to students. I have a daughter. I mean, I'm in the advice giving business all day long. But one of the things that I am very sort of careful about is how I frame this. And I always say, if you are asking me what I would do, or given my conception of what you should be, right? But the idea that something can actually, in fact, be in their interest, independent of them, right? Of their attitudes, I find incomprehensible. It's borderline. I would actually argue it's gibberish. I actually would argue it actually violates. It's semantically, it violates the meaning of the word.
I'm inviting listeners to reflect on whether this really is gibberish, right?
Well, but it doesn't have to be. Look, something can be. I mean, you've read nonsense poetry, right? You know what I mean. Something can be not gibberish in the sense that we understand what it means, but it actually violates a grammar, right? I mean, what I would say is that the notion that this person has no ends that matter to them
presently,
and that somehow independently of that, there are things that are in their interest. And that when I say that, I'm not simply projecting my own conception of what their end should be, I would say is BS, and I would say it's a very common kind of self-delusion that people who like to engage in the advice business often engage in, and I am scrupulously careful when I advise people to not do it. Look, this is the whole what's the matter with Kansas, right? I have no patience for that kind of talk, right? It's self-important, and it's based on nothing, right, other than your own projection onto the other person of what you think they are, what you think they should be, and therefore what's in their best interest. They don't think so.
I find it really odd, and you're not alone in this, but I do find it really odd that sometimes this objection to normativity that's not hypothetical seems to carry like moral overtones, like it's tyrannical, it's imposing. It seems like those are at least implicit appeals to moral norms that you think are bad.
Not in my lexicon. I'm just calling you an asshole.
Okay.
Not you. But I mean, you know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? In other words, I don't see what I see nothing wrong with the just good old garden variety, emotional, attitudinal, sensibility related discourse. I think it's enough to do all the work. And I don't think that the moral discourse does any more work other than invoke a phony kind of force that doesn't really have any basis. And the minute you push on it, it kind of falls apart, right? It ultimately is going to come down to, are you going to actually make me do that? Go ahead, right? Try it.
I don't think it comes down to that. I mean,
but then it's just talk.
It's not just talk, right?
It is to me. It may not be to you, but it is to me.
Okay. For me, moral talk is an attempt to describe like a normative feature of the world that really is there and we really ought to care about. And you can
independently of anybody caring about anything or anything mattering to anybody.
I'm not sure what you mean by that. But I think it could mean, but here's what I do mean. It could be the case that I don't care about it, but I ought to. That could be the case, right? It could be that I don't care at all about giving money to famine relief, but I ought to, because I morally ought to. And you say,
I believe you can say that, but I would then like to hear the story of about what force that has to say.
I'm not sure what kind of a story you're demanding of me. Like
any story. I gave a perfectly straightforward story of what is meant by the hypothetical imperative. I'm just asking for something equally clear and straightforward.
But I don't accept your story about the hypothetical imperative either. You don't
have to accept it. It's my story.
Okay.
You don't get to decide what my reasons for doing things are. They're my reasons, right? Right. So telling you what my reason is. Now you can say, well, that's not your reason, but you have it doesn't cut any ice. I mean, it is my reason whether you accept it or not. And that, with respect to what my reasons are, I do have privilege, right? Epistemically, as well as, in every other respect. So when I tell you that the reason I did this is because I represent, the thing it affects as being a good, where what I mean by that is that it's something that matters to me. That is actually my reason, right?
Okay.
And that doesn't involve anything moral at all, right? That just involves a normal sensibility, right?
It's not plausible because you can imagine something being a good for someone when it doesn't matter to them, right? You might not be able to, but I think most of the people who listen to this are going to be able to say that's at least conceivable.
Not in the absence of some kind of a teleological account of human nature. No, I don't think so.
Why?
Because it has no ground.
I would say that the moral reality itself is the ground. Right?
I would say that begs the question. I would say that's unresponsive. Somebody asks you what the ground of X is, you say, well, X is the ground.
Well, some grounds are primitive. Some things bottom out.
Listen, there are people, Plantinga does this. I mean, you want to say that moral obligations are brute facts, go ahead. I will just tell you that has about as much force as the other version of it had. And think it if you like. I mean, you can enjoy yourself, but it cuts no ice with me. It just doesn't mean anything.
You're not giving me any argument against it. You're just saying it's ridiculous.
Well, I don't feel like I owe you one. I think that if you're going to claim that there is some powerful force that is attached to certain kinds of propositions, the burden is upon you to show me what that force consists of and what grounds it. It's not my job, who doesn't think there is such a thing. I mean, this is just down to it's not my job to prove that there aren't any invisible leprechauns, right? I mean, you're the one making the substantive positive claim, and you bear the burden of proof to demonstrate it and to explain it in some way other than simply stamping your foot and saying it's brute, right? That's not any kind of position. I mean, that's just argument by stipulation. And again, I have no problem if you do it. I have no problem if you want to think of your life this way. But I was always under the impression that the point of ethical discourse, again, is ultimately practical. It's to get people to do certain things and to get them not to do other things. I don't take it as purely a descriptive enterprise as being in any way interesting. And you may, but that's just the extent to which our spheres are just they're not going to overlap. I mean, you're going to be over there doing this and I'm not. But I do think that most people who are invested, especially in very robust realist moral theories, do want this to have some kind of force and efficacy. But then they're going to have to give an account of it and not just say it's brute, right?
I mean, you want to equate force with motivational force.
Yeah, something that actually gets you to do something or not. Okay. Otherwise, I don't know what it means otherwise.
I have a paper under review arguing against motivational internalism. Lots of realists don't accept motivational internalism. The idea that if you have a reason to do X, you're motivated to do it. So it's not clear why I'm supposed to give if you're demanding force in that sense, many of us explicitly reject it.
Look, if you can do whatever you like. I'm just telling you what my understanding of the point of ethical discourse is. If you think ethical discourse has some other point, that's fine. And but nothing's stopping you from pursuing it. But on my conception of what the point of ethical discourse is, the person who's claiming that moral judgments have some special force over and beyond what I would call their sort of, emotional weight, I would think that that they're bound to then give some account of it, and I've yet to hear any account of it other than that it's brute, right? And now you might say, well, it's not force in that sense, but then we're now in the territory of things I'm not interested in, right? I mean, that's a notion of ethics I'm not interested in. I'm not interested in ethics in the same way that I might be interested in metaphysics. Or in epistemology. My interest in ethics is entirely practical. It has to do with human activity, with human action.
That's right. I think it's practical to want to align our behavior with what we really ought to do. And there has to be some kind of regress.
That just seems circular to me. It seems like a very tight circle.
Well,
when I hear that, I imagine a guy in a little tricycle, like just going around like this. It just doesn't resonate with me at all.
Well, if you ask like for any kind of ought, like you're going to ask like, well, why should I do that? And then some kind of reason will be given, right. And then some kind of end, and you're like, well, why should I do that? And then some further reason will be given, and
I don't see why there would be an iteration of should. It seems to me that when you ask me, well, why did you go to the mall? And I tell you, well, I went to the mall because I represent going to the mall as a good, and what I mean by that is there's things in the mall that I care about or that I want to do or that I enjoy or whatever. That seems to me a complete and full explanation. Now, I mean, you can act like a 3-year-old and keep asking why, but that's just a game, right? I mean, I see nothing about that requires further elucidation, and I would argue that most people would understand that explanation perfectly well. It would make perfect sense, and it would explain in a very robust way why the person did something, right? Okay. If you ask me, well, why do you care about that? I might be able to give some answer, but eventually the answers would run out. I mean,
well, the answers are going to run out for you with desire, it sounds like, and so.
Yeah, well, of course, but I would argue that desire is a perfectly understandable notion that has a lot of substance to it, and the notion that you're trying to sort of talk about strikes me as being rather elusive and insubstantial.
Insubstantial in the sense of non-physical, sure.
Well, more than that, though, insubstantial in the sense that I can't really ascribe much content to it. I could speak a lot about why certain things matter to me, and could talk a lot and could give a lot of information about my emotional states, about my relationships, about my history, about all of those sorts of things. But the kind of discourse you're talking about seems very bare. I don't see that there's much that can be said about it other than simply that it is. And in the realm of human action, I just don't find that either illuminating or...
Well, like I said earlier, I find myself to be in the dialectical position of somebody who insists that like they're a skeptic of consciousness itself or something like that, and demanding to be argued into it. And you keep saying, like the way it feels like when you pinch yourself, there's like a feeling, and they're like, nope, don't know what you mean by that. Nope, that's insubstantial. You're not saying anything about neurology here.
Well, if you think I'm doing that, I'm sorry, but I don't think I am, and I'm happy to let the audience decide whether they think I've been doing that. I think I've been speaking in very specific terms, very concrete terms. I haven't invoked any concepts that I've left undefined or simply insisted were brute and said nothing further about them. All the notions that I'm using are perfectly ordinary concepts that we talk about all the time in describing the things we care about, the things we want, the things that we love, the things that we hope for, the things that we aspire to. all of which have a very rich foundation in human nature that we could talk a lot about. But this other realm of discourse that you're describing strikes me as very abstract, very barren, very resistant or resilient to any kind of substantive unpacking, and very tightly circular. And so, I mean, that's not a fault in the sense that, some people like doing that sort of thing, but to me, ethics it's so not what ethics should be about, because ethics ultimately is about people and what they do and how they interact and relate. And that has to be all tied up with the substantial elements of human nature and not sort of these a priori concepts.
I think ethics has got to be about more than what I happen to want. What I ought to do, at least we've got to understand the possibility of those things coming apart. But this makes me think perhaps it would be useful to take a step back and return to something we talked about in our previous discussion about peer disagreement.
Yeah.
I found this, this is not the first time I've had this kind of conversation with an anti-realist. And I find it frustrating. It seems like it's frustrating on the other end too. But it might be that there's something epistemically interesting to diagnose here, or at least label and think about, which is I find myself in these conversations with some anti-realists where it seems like, to me, like the most important concept, the most interesting, important concept of normativity, the whole reason I'm studying ethics is I believe in this. I believe this is a real aspect of reality. And I talk to certain anti-realists who seem to just not understand what it is I'm even talking about, insist they don't, and including people who've published papers in moral philosophy, people I've cited, stuff like this. And I've had a similar kind of argument with Alistair Norcross that's been going on for years and years. He was one of the...
He's not a moral anti-realist, though, is he? Isn't he like a hardcore utilitarian?
I mean, he's a scalar utilitarian, but this is the thing is, so he defines, he says, yeah, there are moral truths, but he wants to ultimately say that the moral domain is just another D reason in the sense that Sarah Stroud mentions, in the sense that you're okay with, in the sense that I want to say more reasons are more than that.
Yeah.
So I think that evacuates it of all content. And so we had this disagreement, and that first paper I sent you about normative pluralism. Yeah. That is my best shot at refuting this. I think I've done it. I'm leaving that alone. But before going my arguments against it, we don't even have to talk about that. But just the disagreement itself, it arose like this. We were talking about Singer's child drowning in a pond case, and of course, he and I both agree. Yes, you morally ought to save the child that's drowning in the pond right in front of you if you can, and there's no substantial cost to you. We agree about that. But then I would also say, wait, what if you morally ought to save the child, but you prudentially ought not to because there's some like monetary cost to you for saving the child. You ruin your shoes or whatever. And Alistair will say, well, morally you ought to save the child, and like pragmatically or prudentially you ought not to. And I want to say yes, but like all things considered, you ought to save the child. And Alistair says, I don't know what you mean by that. Do you mean all things considered morally or all things considered prudentially? And I want to say, no, like I mean like all things considered. I mean like what you really ought to do. And he'll say, I don't know what you mean by that. And I find it really puzzling because it seems to me that if you don't, and I would say the all things considered ought is really the regress stopper here. I want to then make a further claim and identify the moral ought with the all things considered ought, but that's a whole different picture. But in any event, I find myself in this really interesting puzzle, like, wow, we talked about ethics on all of these other things, and we've agreed about some things and disagreed about others. And, I cite his work, and he's on my dissertation committee. But then when it comes to, like, what I think is, like, the fundamental normative concept here, I am sure I have a very clear conception of this, and so do many other people I've talked to. But then Alistair and then like some other people, not just him, say like, no, I don't know what you mean by that. It's got to be bound to some domain that like I happen to care about. And I think, oh my God, no, like.
Yeah, I tend to agree with them. I do think, it's funny, the way you formulated this does resonate with me across a number of subject areas. So when you said this, when Norcross says, well, morally speaking, yes, you ought to, but prudentially speaking, you ought not to. And then you said, no, but what really ought you to?
Yeah.
That reminds me of that kind of use of really in metaphysics. And I always think that everything that follows those reallys is always a mistake. And represents a kind of pre-Kantian, but a pre-Kantian and pre-Wittgensteinian understanding of things that fails to recognize the sort of the fundamental framework dependence of every mode of discourse. Right? There are no skyhooks. Right? Right. I mean, and Bernard Williams actually states this beautifully in his paper, The Human Prejudice, which is an outstanding essay, as is everything that Williams does. He's probably in my view, the best philosopher, best post-World War II moral ethicist that we've had. And, I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Except Derek Parfit.
Oh, I think Williams blows Parfit away. But anyway, I find Parfit wildly overrated. And far less literate and far less broadly educated than Williams. There's no view from nowhere. There's no position from above or position abstracted from. It's just not possible. And I really do think that by this point, if you were going to ask me, has anything really been demonstrated in philosophy? I would say the fundamental framework relative nature of all discourse is one of those things. You're trying to ask what Carnap calls external questions. And I just think that that's fundamentally mistaken. That is a fundamentally mistaken thing to do. And that we've now been around this enough time since the 17th, 18th centuries that this is something we really all should know by now. So yes, I agree entirely with Norcross, and I don't believe that there is any frame of reference free position from which to make the claims that you're making. Now, look, I mean, I do think that there is a way of articulating what you were trying to say to Alistair that doesn't have to reject the idea of framework relativity or framework dependency, and that would be to simply say that, yes, there are these different frameworks, but the normative framework is always, the moral framework is always overriding of all the others, right? In other words, I think that's a perfectly coherent thing to say. And it doesn't force one to sort of depend on non-existent skyhooks, but I don't accept it. I mean, I'm in that regard, I'm very much on board with Susan Wolf. I don't think moral considerations are always overriding of all others. And I think there would be an absolute, the world in which it was is one I wouldn't want to live in. I would dislike intensely. Because it would be a world that would not include not most of the things that are the reasons why I care about getting up in the morning, and living another day. So, I would hate a world where everyone acted on the principle that moral considerations are always overriding while others. But there's nothing wrong with the view conceptually, intellectually, in terms of coherence wise. But I agree with him that there are no framework independent modes of discourse.
And by a framework, can a framework be true or false?
No.
Okay.
This is just straight out, flat out Wittgenstein. This is flat out Wittgenstein. Yeah. And Carnap and empiricism, semantics, and ontology. Right.
I think it's worth remarking here. When I read your article on prescription, I thought, oh boy, we're going to find ourselves on the other side of a very sharp divide here. But maybe there's some good to now assess where this leads us. So, and all the people you tend to cite and think most highly of are the ones I think, oh, these are the philosophers who just don't get normativity, is my reaction. So we're on the other side. So there are definitely people in your camp on this for sure, and other philosophers I've talked to had similar conversations. So then there's this question of, okay, let's think of this as an epistemic peers sort of situation, whereas I think there's this fundamental conceptual category that it just seems like you're oblivious to, uninterested in, don't understand. I don't even know what to say. Whereas you think no, there are these desires and things that are grounded in interest to me, and that makes sense. And then there's this weird skyhooky stuff going on, and what is that? Whereas I think calling something like a skyhook, or just repeating the word queerness or weird or mysterious a bunch of times is not an argument. Okay, so we're each on apparently different sides of some really deep divide, where it appears to each of us that the other is begging the question or refusing to acknowledge the other's point. I think that's a fair way to characterize where we are without begging the question in favor of either of us. So what should we conclude from this kind of a disagreement? What lessons can we learn?
This sort of disagreement is what I would predict, given what I think philosophy is. I mean, we talked about this last time. This is why I don't think that there is any fact of the matter to which philosophical propositions correspond. It's why I don't think philosophy is that kind of activity. I think that philosophical theories are, to a far greater extent, expressions of the temperament and sensibilities of the people who hold them, rather than theories in the matter of theories in science. I actually think it's a very bad idea to call what philosophers do theorizing. I think that word should be reserved for scientific theories. Massimo likes to use the word accounts to talk about what philosophers do, which, I have no problem with. But this disagreement between us is exactly what I would expect. And I bet you if we sat down together with a group of people and sort of chatted about it, once people got to know us, they could probably predict the disagreement on the basis of the differences between us in terms of background, temperament, religion or lack thereof, family, all sorts of things, generation. Where we disagree is going to be at the most fundamental levels. So in terms of probably first order ethics, we probably don't disagree very much at all. Probably the things that you wouldn't do are very similar to the things I wouldn't do. And vice versa. The things that I would do are probably very similar to the things you would do. The difference is the story in which we place all of that. And that has to do with, I would say, would probably be most explicable just in terms of our differences as people. I know this is disappointing because you have almost a sacralized conception of philosophy, but I just don't. I mean, I think one of philosophy's greatest problems is that it's had a serious misconception of itself, which is why, if you ask me who's in the top 5 greatest philosophers of all time, I would include the later Wittgenstein in that group, because I think he was one of the ones who most clearly demonstrated just how mistaken about itself philosophy was. But I would also include people like Hume and others who attempted to sort of pierce through the rationalist, small r, rationalist pretensions, conceits of philosophy. And I should just want to say one thing. I do not mean skyhook as some sort of a term of abuse. I'm using it probably because Williams uses it. I was using it to try and give some sense or characterization of the person who wants to say that a certain kind of discourse is not dependent upon a frame of reference, right? That there is some neutral or God's eye or independent position from which you can cash out that. But what really exists, but what really ought you to do, that only is intelligible if there is a kind of a perspectiveless perspective, but I don't think that there is. So when I said skyhooks, I don't mean that. I'm not yelling queer like Mackie is. I don't think there's anything queer about it. I just think it's mistaken, right? And I think I can show why. I could walk you through the arguments from Kant to Quine to Wittgenstein as to why that idea of independent, topic neutral, whatever you want to call that position from which you think you're able to discern, know, and say various things. I could explain why that's mistaken. It would take a long time. We'd have to walk through a lot of the history of philosophy. But I could explain why that's mistaken. So it's not meant as a term of abuse. It's meant, I mean it substantively. If you're right, then there are sort of proverbial skyhooks, right? I just don't think you're right about it. And I think that's really what philosophy has been doing since Kant. Has been trying to work out what was wrong, what's wrong with that picture, right? I almost view you as holding almost a kind of a Cartesian without all the dualism and stuff, but you strike me as almost a pre-Kantian, have a pre-Kantian view of philosophy, and I just think that is just flat out unsustainable and has been demonstrated to be so to the extent to which anything can be demonstrated in philosophy, which, as you know, I think really can't, right? But to the extent to which we do, I think there's been a sort of an accumulation that just makes that a fucking Everest to sort of climb back to, right? That's just not going to happen. And in the continental tradition, it's even worse, right? They're even more down that road. Postmodernism is sort of Wittgenstein and steroids, right? But in the even the analytic tradition, I just don't think that that's sustainable anymore. And this is why I can't listen. It's not just you. This is why I can't stand these sort of, Churchland and other, science is everything. People.
I got to tell you,
it's a similar kind of thing. They just.
So this is my complaint about what I perceive to be just sort of sneering dismissal of the idea that there could be like a moral reality that not discoverable by science and not relative to some conversational context that is stipulated
and not religious.
Not religious, yeah.
Right. I'm not sneering. I don't know if other people are sneering you. That is my intention.
Okay, I
not to be sneering. I take that quite seriously. I just think it's fundamentally wrong, right?
Okay, here's an example of that sneering, though. This is which was, and I have encountered this. I have encountered this a number of times.
To sneer at Plato is stupid. You're not smarter than him, right? So I hope I'm not sneering. I hope I'm not doing that.
Some of the language you've used and some of the language that came up with your conversation with Massimo that I listened to from 2015, it just, you both mentioned the queerness, Mackey's queerness objection, and yep, that's dead on, or at least it sounded that way to me. You were quite happy with yeah, a moral reality that's not based in God, that would just be weird.
I do think it's weird, and I accept the queerness objection in one way, but not in another. But anyway, we could talk more about that another time since we're already almost at 2 hours. But go on. What were you going to say?
Yeah, I was at one of these graduate student lunches with Patricia Churchland a couple of years ago. And she was going around the table asking, what do you all work on? And they were the other graduate students were always using the word empirically informed in their answers.
Yeah.
Even though some of them I thought, you're not doing XPhi, you're not in the CogSci program. What are you empirically informed? and then she gets to me. She's like, and I said, well, something like, well, I'm the atheist at the Pope's party, I guess, but I do like non-naturalist, moral realism, very a priori intuition based. And she I swear, has this kind of facial expression. She's like, there's no Plato's heaven because where is it? How could there be? And then moves on. And it's it's that kind of thing where it's like, okay, there are different, there are epistemic objections you could level at my position. I think actually I agree with you that the epistemic ones are probably some of the most troubling. How do we know these kinds of facts if they are as I described them? There are some puzzles there. But very often it seems like I just encounter this sort of incredulity that there could be thought of the kind that I'm describing or moral reasons of the kind that I'm describing. And it seems like I'm put at this disadvantage where I have this uphill battle to get my interlocutor to admit that this isn't just completely insane before the conversation's even started, really.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I don't think it's insane. And it can't be insane because it was for so long the dominant view of such fine thinkers. Can't be insane. What I do think, though, is that the Western tradition, philosophical tradition, made some sort of fundamental decisions in the 1600s and 1700s, and then again in the early 20th century, that simply render that earlier view no longer available. Right? It's not that the view is crazy. It's that we no longer accept enough of the concepts that are necessary for it to stand up. That's why I think Anscombe's critique is so strong, because she is not suggesting that this has never been an adequate framework, an adequate way of or a correct way of thinking. For God's sake, she is a religious theist herself, right? What she's saying is that modern philosophy does not have the resources to make sense of this idea, right? Now,
there are many who disagreed with that.
Well, sure they have. I mean, listen, there's nothing that a lot of people haven't disagreed with. That's neither here nor there. I'm just telling you why I find it so strong. Now, it may be that in order for me really to understand your position and for you to make it fully, we would have to walk through all those fundamental modern and 20th century developments that I think and Anscombe thinks renders those concepts unavailable. And it may turn out that you reject a number of them. All right. I would then find your position more intelligible, because I would say, okay, he doesn't think we lost that idea in the scientific revolution. Oh, he doesn't think we no longer have access to that because of Quinean indeterminacy. Right? In other words, I have no doubt that there is a version of your position, a way of stating your position that I would understand, but probably we would have to go very deep into the architecture of it. Because I suspect that what's going to, because you're not a retro guy, you're not simply, re-invoking Aquinas, right? And so I'm assuming that some of these key developments in philosophy, both in the Enlightenment and then in the early 20th century, which took a number of resources away from us that we used to have, right? I suspect that what I would find is that you will reject at various points that we actually lost those concepts, or that we don't have another way of sustaining them or upholding them or whatever. Listen, I've had this conversation with Massimo. I don't think you can ground a virtue ethics in the contemporary conception of human nature. He does. I don't think that there's enough of a thick notion of purpose in the modern biological framework.
I think I would agree with you on that one.
So, but all that I'm saying is that the fact that, in this conversation, the time we have, I wasn't able to get from you something that to me was substantial enough that I could even grasp onto it. Doesn't mean that I don't think there is. I just suspect that it's way deep down in the architecture that you think you have the right to use certain concepts that I don't think you do, and that's because I accept certain developments that happen in the Enlightenment in the 20th century, and you probably don't, right? And that's where the disagreement ultimately is going to wind up at least becoming explicable, right? And that's why it looks now like we're just banging on each other, and that's because we need to go several layers down. I suspect some of it has to do with our views of Kant, what Kant demonstrated in the critique, not in the ethics. I suspect it's going to have to do with disagreements over the interpretation of Quine, or whether we accept certain implications of the indeterminacy of translation. Probably a lot's going to depend upon Wittgenstein, our views of the later Wittgenstein and the investigations. But sneering, I'm not. I mean, maybe I made a joke with Massimo here or there. It's also very different when you're having a conversation with somebody about something on which you both pretty much agree.
Right. No,
and when you're talking to somebody, who holds the other view. So yeah, I mean, I do not. If I gave the impression that I don't think that your view is articulable, I shouldn't have. I just don't think it's been articulated yet, and
all
probably
right,
that's because we have to do a lot of deeper digging, right?
Perhaps we should move into closing statements.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I actually don't have anything more to add on this at this level. But please, you should say, whatever you want to say in closing.
Okay, closing statements. So I begin by trying to articulate what moral realism means, and I noted some difficulties with the details with regard to mind independence.
Yeah.
And we sort of skipped over that. And I then characterized the significance of the moral realism debate, the moral realism, anti-realism debate, as having to do with the nature of normative authority. The nature of why should these claims be authoritative. And the rest of our debate has been about this. So I think that there are grounds for saying that you really, all things considered, ought to do certain things and refrain from doing other things like murder, rape, fraud, what have you. I do not think that this is defined internally to some sort of a context, but I think that there is a metaphysical ground for this that is moral reality. I tend to think that those facts are going to be non-naturalistic, but I'm willing to be ecumenical about that. And so then we went on and we discussed sort of the nature of this kind of apparent intractable disagreement, whereas you see normativity, in as much as it exists at all, as being like almost analytically related to desire. I tried to push in the direction of we can conceive of at least well-being being independent of someone's desires, or at least their present desires. And I was hoping to use that as a wedge to push for perhaps other kinds of desire-independent norms. And yeah, I think that is pretty much where we ended up at. Anything you have to add?
No, I think it's a perfectly fair characterization. And the only thing that would add in my half of it is that I rejected that independent notion of interests, and I wasn't satisfied that the account of the actual nature and substance of the authority you're appealing to, that's independent of any actual sanction either from God, by gods or men, I wasn't satisfied that had been articulated. And I, at the end, suspect that it couldn't be articulated unless we did a much deeper dive and discovered that, as I suspect, you're going to think that certain concepts are available to you to use to ground those things, and I'm going to say that they're not, that you don't have the right to use them. And so I suspect that our disagreements ultimately are going to rest upon fundamental disagreements in metaphysics, epistemology, and the philosophy of language. I actually don't think that the disagreements are fundamentally at the level of ethics. And I suspect that we would find that in other practical disciplines we have similar disagreements, like in aesthetics or like in philosophy of action, In other areas, I suspect we're going to find similar disagreements because they all come from a similar root that you think you have certain notions available to you that I don't think you do. And I might be wrong, by the way, about that because I'm just assuming that you accept most of the modern framework. If you don't, or if you think we don't have to, then I might actually say, well, if that's the case, then you are correct, and I would agree with you, right? I mean, I could see that, right, happening. But we'd have to go to the deeper dive to get to that to see whether that is the case or not. So, all right. Hey, man, that situation there, strength and goodwill and fingers crossed that everything turns out okay and that you stay okay. And I hope you're holding up psychologically okay. It's got to be tremendously stressful.
Yeah, it's not too bad. Work out here. I work on a paper here. I can do most of the stuff I need to do as a philosophy researcher in my own room. But the uncertainty is the difficult thing.
And the separation from loved ones and stuff is probably not easier either. All right, my friend. Well, Spencer, thank you so much. And I look forward to the next time.
Thank you.
All right, take care.